नहीं किया गया। सवाल यह है कि क्या प्रोत्साहन के बिना बचत रह सकेगी?
बिल्कुल गौरव, मुझे लगता है हम सभी जब अपनी टैक्स प्लानिंग करते हैं ना, हम बहुत सारे इन्वेस्टमेंट इसलिए करते हैं क्योंकि हमें ईटीसी की छूट मिलती है। आप भी वो करते होंगे कि ईटीसी की छूट मिलती है। पर अब सरकार ने इस बजट में कह दिया वो ईटीसी की छूट पाने वाली उस कैटेगरी में जिसमें मैं और गौरव और आप लोग के कई लोग आते होंगे, उसको हम थोड़ा सा वो जो है इग्नोर करती हुई नजर आ रही है और नई टैक्स रिजीम को जो है ज्यादा पसंद करवाने की कोशिश में जुटी हुई है। लेकिन चुनौतियां भी बहुत है। क्या लोग इन हालात में आर्थिक तौर पर खुद को और परिवार को कैसे सुरक्षित रखेंगे? क्योंकि अभी तक तो एक टैक्स का लॉलीपॉप रहता था जिसके लिए वो करते थे। तो मनी 9 फाइनेंशियल फ्रीडम समिट का अब आ रहा है बहुत ही महत्वपूर्ण पैनल। हमारा इस सेशन को मॉडरेट कर रहे हैं टीवी 9 कन्नड़ के संपादक आर श्रीधरन जी, और उनके साथ मंच पर जुड़ने वाले खास मेहमान गौरव आपको इंट्रोड्यूस करवाएंगे।
बिल्कुल, मैं चाहूंगा कि आपको हमारा जो अगला पैनल है उससे इंट्रोड्यूस करवाऊं। श्रीधरन, आप प्लीज उनको लेकर आइए। बंधन बैंक के चीफ इकोनॉमिस्ट तथा वाइस प्रेसिडेंट सिद्धार्थ सान्याल हमारे बीच आ चुके हैं। उनका जोरदार तालियों के साथ स्वागत करते हैं। एक्सिस बैंक के चीफ इकोनॉमिस्ट और एग्जीक्यूटिव वाइस प्रेसिडेंट सौगत भट्टाचार्य इस वक्त हमारे साथ हैं। बहुत स्वागत है आपका। और रेटिंग एजेंसी केयर रेटिंग्स के चीफ इकोनॉमिस्ट रजनी सिन्हा इस वक्त हमारे साथ हैं। मैम, आपका बहुत स्वागत है। और अतुल जोशी जो कि एक फेमस इकोनॉमिस्ट हैं और इंडिया रेटिंग्स और फिच के साथ जुड़े हुए हैं। सर, आप भी प्लीज आइए और मंच पर अपना आसन ग्रहण करिए। बहुत स्वागत है। श्रीधरन, इट्स ऑल योर्स नाउ। थैंक यू।
Thank you, Priyanka and Gaurav. I think the panel that we have chosen for, the topic that we've chosen for this afternoon is really at the heart of what Money9 is about as a product, which is to ensure that we are able to empower every Indian with financial freedom. But that is easier said than done. If we take even the richest country in the world, which is the US, the situation isn't very good. In fact, some of the data that comes out of US might quite shock you. For example, 2/3 of Americans live paycheck to paycheck. So if they didn't get their next month's salary, 2/3 of Americans won't be able to meet any of their EMIs or even run their households. Similarly, a similar number of Americans wouldn't be able to raise $500 or $1,000 in unanticipated expenses without borrowing from, let's say, friends, family, or on credit card. So if that is the situation in a country like the US, in India where 46% of our households make less than 15,000 rupees a month, how feasible is this goal or this dream of making every Indian financially independent? So for today's panel, I'm going to break up my discussion into 3 large buckets. One, we're going to look at what can we do in terms of changing the habits of our investors and how do we raise the awareness. Second, I'll want the expert panelists also to talk about, now that we are living in a high inflation, high risk and a very uncertain environment, what kind of a saving strategy or investment strategy are you going to need? Finally, I'm going to look at, is there room for policymakers to step in more aggressively perhaps and make investment more attractive for retail investors? So let me start with the first, get the discussion rolling. Rajani, let me start with you. Why is it that after so many years, most Indians still prefer to park their money in savings account, post office account, savings account there? And why is there so much of a caution when it comes to money?
So let me begin by throwing some statistics to set the perspective. So if we look at the overall savings of households, more than 50% goes into physical assets, which would be real estate and gold, and less than 50% goes into financial assets, which has just about changed for last year with financial assets becoming more than 50%, but broadly that's the trend. Now, even in financial assets, like you said, around 50% goes into bank deposits and currency, cash. So it's only the remaining 50% which goes into other assets, and into something like stock market and mutual funds, only around 4% goes into that segment. So definitely there's a lot of caution which is being exercised here. And I would say the main reason for that is still lack of awareness. A lack of awareness about financial products, lack of access to do that kind of investment. So now the banking sector's penetration has improved. So most of the people, even in smaller cities and towns, have bank deposits. But in smaller cities and towns, they still do not have good awareness of other financial products. So in insurance, we still have around 15 to 17% of financial savings going into insurance products. Even into PPF, we have around 15-16%. But what is really required is to increase awareness about investment in stock market and in mutual funds, which has improved in the last few years, but a lot more needs to be done.
Right. I think that really is the key to my mind. And, you know, before I go to Atul, let me ask Saugata this. In my own family circle, I have a lot of friends, even some of my siblings, who really don't want to educate themselves about investment options. I mean, that's the honest thing, I guess. Is it because they're scared of numbers? Or do they find understanding financial instruments so complex that they take the safety of, let's say, a bank deposit or a real estate or gold or something like a post office savings? Saugata, to your mind, what is really going on here?
So first, thank you TV9 for this opportunity of being here. Wonderful opportunity. So it's a complex environment. Look at it, I mean, take slices of the age groups. So people in my age groups who are not very financially savvy, and potentially that's the way it should be. So relatively midlife people should be investing in more secure products. Stock market, say for instance, is the game of the young. And that's the rule of thumb, that your age minus, the 100 minus your age should be your allocation to the equity markets. And equity markets, again, is, you know, you park your money in equities and forget about it for 10 years. So that's a young man's game. Now the young man's game, young men's, women's game is also now the cryptocurrencies. Yeah, I mean, now it's coming down a little bit. So that's one. The biggest thing, so I mean, that partially explains. The second part is income distribution. Incomes in India and disposable incomes, that is after the basic, the expenditures, etc. So disposable incomes is concentrated in the top 3 or 4 10% deciles, as they are called. So so they have the maximum amount of savings, disposable incomes. In that, I think there is a fair bit of, and particularly amongst the younger groups in that bucket, I think there's a fair bit of understanding of, and particularly when in the last 2 or 3 years when equity markets go up like a rocket, so then there's a huge shift. And which is understandable. I mean, you know, for many people, I mean, in the big cities, even in tier 2 cities, that people see that when bank rates of interest, even fixed deposits, is much less than the current inflation, whereas your equity markets are giving you 10% return. So there is a huge shift, which you saw in the SIPs, investments in mutual funds, investment in direct equities, and cryptocurrencies, of course. I mean, so all of that. So that shot up. And now that the equity markets are down, so is the investment in mutual. So that implies a certain amount of, and in mutual funds, remember that they had penetrated down into the tier 2 and even in some cases in tier 3 cities. So that a fair bit of money was coming in from that. So I think basically amongst the target segment where a lot of savings, financial savings, as Rajani said, I mean, you know, still there's a huge amount, and particularly I'm sure from the semi-urban and the rural areas, investment in fixed, in physical assets. So I think there is a fair bit of literacy, not generally, I completely agree. So that needs to be done. But I think people are savvy enough to realize where the returns of their financial savings are going to come from, adjusted for some bit of risk. And now, given the carnage that we are seeing, I mean, a lot of the young people who are coming in from the tech sector, the global capability centers, so those people have now realized that they actually need to save more. So, I mean, the good times are gone. Yeah? So I think it's a complex melange of things, but the basic thing, if you want to increase financial savings, the one thing that explains financial savings increase is high growth. So whatever else needs to be done, and hundreds of things need to be done, what the basic thing that needs to be done is get your growth rate up.
Right. So that is something which is not in the hands of an ordinary Joe like me, for example. But I still need to secure my family. I need to educate my children. I need to get my son, daughter married, buy a house, buy a car, everything. So Siddharth and Atul, the other point which Saugata made is that it is not so much a lack of awareness. While that is definitely there. But what he's hinting at is basically that there's a relatively low risk appetite among us Indian savers and investors. So let me start with Atul, then we'll go to Siddharth. Is it a function of risk or is it still a disposable issue?
I think it's function of both. If you look at the disposable income, consistently it's been coming off. And the way to look at it is to look at how the Indians have been borrowing. If I look at 2010 data, the personal loans outstanding from banking system to individuals was about 6 lakh crores, thereabouts. 2020, it became 25 lakh crores. And from 2020 March to December 23, that 25 lakh crores has become 40 lakh crores. Now add to this the amount that the banking system disbursed to NBFCs, which moved from 1 lakh crores in 2010 March to 16 lakh crores by December 22. Add to this the loans given by microfinance institutions, the lending platforms, the gold loan companies, etc., etc. My sense is about 35 crore people on an average should be the borrowers, the number, in terms of numbers. Now this is exactly opposite of our ancient wisdom. In Hindi we say that ki Deva Daitya hai. Deva is borrowing. Deva Daitya hai Kaliyug ka. It takes life away. So, we have lost that wisdom. We are borrowing for living in the present. And, the Bappi Lahiri song, Kal kya hoga kisko pata, abhi zindagi ka le lo maja. So everybody is taking maja, which is consumption, which is reflected in housing, etc., etc. But it is something which is doing away with the savings. So one is the attitude. The second is the risk. As Saugata very rightly said, it's a factor of age and also the understanding that one has to develop. There is not enough dissemination. The entire information is, let's say, centered around either mutual funds or insurance companies. They have the money, they have the power, they have the ears of the regulators. But there are so many other things which are good products, but there is no dissemination of information. The third thing I would say is the regulators need to play their part. One of the RBI governors simply shifted the whole interest rate risk from banks to the individuals. It was Urjit Patel, I think, who said that housing loans will now be linked to repo. Now, I don't know, it just beats my logic as to who is more capable of managing the interest rate risk. You're going to see, the repo rate increases and you're going to see the kind of stress on housing loans, personal loans, vehicle loans. This takes away your savings potential. Regulators need to intervene and think about what they've done. So there are so many things about savings which one needs to really look at. It's a complex picture, but the more, let's say, attitude we develop, the more information we give, little bit of regulatory intervention and product innovation, we are there.
Great. So Siddharth, Atul's thrown an interesting point into the mix, which is that increasingly Indians are spenders and not savers. Atul, correct me if I'm wrong, that's essentially one of the threads that's emerging from what you just said.
Yes.
So do numbers bear out? And obviously he's talked about the NBFC borrowing numbers. But according to you, what's really going on? Are we like, the economic growth obviously has to come at the back of consumption. Bappi Lahiri song, your take?
I'd put it this way. Over the longer term, if I take a 10-year horizon, I'm pretty positive, quite bullish on overall financial saving, overall savings rate, households I'm talking about. as well as financial savings rate in particular. I'll try to explain why I think that way. Think about yourself, think about any other individual. Savings rate is a function of what? Savings rate is a function of, all the speakers have also indicated about that in some way or other. Broadly, we can think about, unless there is very significant change in risk assessment or stuff like that, it's broadly a function of your disposable income and the return you get out of that. If you want to make it slightly more spicy, you can call it risk-adjusted return. Let us not get there. So basically disposable income and return. Now, at this moment, last few years, we have seen a situation where there has been a very significant headwind for disposable income in general. From both sides, in terms of overall income growth, there has been a bit of a dent in that, as well as because overall inflation, etc., basic inflation level had been very significantly high, your disposable income has been coming down even more. And also, to some extent, here the return factor didn't really play too much of a role. In fact, in some of the segments, we have seen returns or the rate of interest or the stock market, yield, whatever you call it, have also have actually gone higher. But here there is a classic case of what in terms of economics we call the income effect versus the substitution effect. It's not a substitution between both these things have actually come into play. The income effect didn't really allow the overall pull for savings to go up. And also, in terms of, didn't really, was not helped by the substitution effect either. So in the near term, we got one particular phenomena which you don't really expect to persist for a very, very long period of time. Over the longer period of time, you are actually seeing overall income level going higher, awareness going higher. People are inclined to hold less money for their cash transaction. There is a possibility 10 years down the line, people might be willing to go with thinner amount of cash in their wallet and pocket. So all these things structurally are good factors for boosting savings and financial savings in general. Add to this particular factor one particular phenomena that when we are talking about say 10 years down the line, we are talking about the per capita income or overall income for an average individual moving to a zone where he or she can think a little more proactively about saving, meeting all the consumption and essential needs, right? So we'll be, as a nation, we'll be moving in that direction. Awareness level will be slightly more. So overall, I see reasons to be more hopeful about savings and financial savings in particular over a 10-year horizon. While I completely agree that the phenomena didn't really hold too well over the last, say, 3 years, right. Or you cannot be that sure about the next 2 years.
All right. So, Rajani, let me ask you one question on this topic before we move to the next two other sub-themes. Do you think the increasing digitization and digital banking and the ease with which people are now able to send and receive, money on their smartphones, is that going to spur a change in investment habits, and therefore we will see a greater sophistication among investors in terms of their own financial security?
Definitely, this is going to pan out over the next few years. In terms of digitization, we have seen a very big boom, and especially during the pandemic. And we are seeing it in all spheres of life. And definitely, even in investment, we saw it growing by leaps and bounds during pandemic. So that's definitely going to help. But what is also important, which I also raised last time, when we are talking about awareness, we are not talking about awareness amongst people like us, people we see around us. We are talking about awareness in other age groups, in other income categories, in other societies, in other cities, in smaller towns. So yes, investment in mutual funds and SIPs have started happening, but we are talking about a much, much bigger pace which we want. So that is something which is going to take time. So even this, talking about digitization and adoption of that in the investment and how we invest, all that is happening. Right now, it's kind of, I would say limited to a set of people. But the whole digitization process, the way even the uneducated people and the working class is adopting to digitization, it's phenomenal. So it will take some time before it moves to that segment. But I think what is more important is to overall increase more awareness about other financial products, apart from the saving schemes and bank deposits, which everyone is aware of.
Right, okay. So now let me come to the next bit that I wanted all the panelists to talk about is the uncertain and the high interest rate environment in which all of us are living currently. I hope it doesn't last for too long, but no one can really predict how long this is going to last or not last. So Atul, let me start with you. Given that interest rates are probably going to keep going up, at least in the US and other developed countries, and as a result, India may also need to, although today we saw that industry and other economists are urging RBI not to increase interest rates, put a pause on interest rate hikes. What kind of an approach would you advise investors or savers to adopt at this time?
Two things. One is that we are almost near the peak, to my mind. I think by October we should start seeing RBI at least reducing rates. And I'm not saying that RBI is going to do it voluntarily. RBI will be forced because of external events if they don't kind of pause now. So give or take, October is where the peak is. So start locking into longer term, high interest rate instruments right away. So one is that whatever instruments you are purchasing or investing in, this is a time to lock into the long term. That's one. The second thing is that you continuously have excess money which you want to reinvest. Look at some of the alternates other than the mutual funds and the insurance companies. For example, RBI has actually floated a retail GSEC platform. I'm not sure how many of you actually look at it, but historically, let me tell you that bank FD rates are about 100 to 250 basis points. 1 से 1.5% कम होता है comparative maturity of GSEC historically, last 20 years. So why invest in a bank FD when RBI gives you the facility to invest in GSEC, and you can invest as low as 5,000 rupees. Just go to RBI website, look at retail investments. You can straightway take exposure and earn 100 to 250 basis points of higher interest rate for the same maturity. The third thing would be to look at alternate investment instruments. For example, today a lot of tech platforms give you ability to invest in invoice discounting, 10,000 rupees to whatever amounts you want to invest up to 1 crore. You can take the risk if you want. I mean, analyze the risk, invest it, but it gives you anything between 10% to 13%. Maturity 30 days to 90 days. So that's another option which you have. You have the bond platforms. You can invest in bonds. So these are the things which I think digitally the savings are getting disrupted away from the traditional mutual funds and the insurance companies. So keep your eyes and ears open, and if you look around, there are enough and more options for you to look at and invest and increase your yield on your idle funds, short term, long term, and even in the high interest rates.
Right. So Saugata, once again, it does appear there are enough instruments and enough options available. It boils down again to lack of awareness and people acting on those options. So whose job is it to really create this awareness? Obviously, Money9 takes this job very seriously, but I guess there has to be some sort of a push which comes from industry as well as the government as well. So how would you address this?
So again, whose job is it to increase savings? Take the example of China. China's savings rate at its peak, now it's come down a little bit, was 50% of GDP. Ours was about at the peak, at the best days was 36 odd percent. Yeah? So China's thing is a government thing. So China's savings to fund China's growth and investment, because their growth was investment led. Yeah, so banks used to offer 0.5% or 1%. So and there were no social safety nets, etc., just like in India. So the point was to sustain China's growth, you had domestic funds, but you didn't have domestic consumption. So China's consumption had to come from abroad. So its exports was the engine of growth using domestic savings. That was a government-led. So the government actually repressed interest rates and extracted savings from households. Yeah. Should India do the same? Probably not. And we are increasing our exports, but it will take some time to hit anywhere close to what China's export levels were and how China's exports helped its domestic growth. So in India's case, again, just like in the last budget that you saw, I mean, people have been criticizing the budget that not enough incentives have been given for increasing disposable incomes, taxes have not been cut. I think one of the best ways to do this is to get the overall levels of interest rates down. It has to be balanced because, I mean, from a borrower's perspective, the guys who invest, so lower interest rates is good, but from a depositor's point of view, you need a certain amount of, so that balance is very difficult. I mean, so and again, when you are borrowing, you actually are investing that you are earning some income. So that level is good. The point that the fiscal deficit did not do enough to get this done, I think the good point is that narrowed the borrowing. So if the government's borrowing does not explode, then your overall levels of interest rates begins to come down, and more importantly, so does inflation. Because inflation is the biggest killer of savings, of consumption, etc. So that needs to come down. That is slowly coming down. So from the push and pull factors, from the government's push factors, I think the government is doing more or less close to what it ideally should be doing. From the pull factors, from our industry, insurance industry, you just saw the industry, heard the industry panel, industry, provident funds, etc., and mutual funds. And so from the pull factors, I think probably something else needs to be done. But again, I mean, a lot of these are dependent on markets. Only very sophisticated investors, the people in this room, many of your listening audience, will be able to time the changes in interest rates, etc. Because remember, the returns, which is, as Siddhartha also mentioned, that returns are a big factor in determining savings behavior. So returns are very economic cycle dependent. How you change your your allocation asset is what determines your return, not so much the individual bonds or stocks or whatever. So that's something that the mutual funds say industry, for instance. People during the pandemic became very conscious of the need for insurance, because mortality rates increased, etc. That is again coming down. So, I mean, if you talk to insurance, you will hear that in tier 2, tier 3 cities, the demand for insurance premier products are beginning to come off. So this is a complex environment. I mean, what's the role of the government? What's the role of the individual? But the government's role and the regulator's role is definitely increasing financial literacy, safety, risks, etc.
Right. So, Siddharth, since we have a lot of people watching us online on Money9 Hindi and Bharatvarsh also, मैं आपसे ये हिंदी में पूछूंगा ये वाला सवाल कि अभी जो सौगता जी ने कहा था कि there are a lot of options available, but इसको मैनेज करना आना चाहिए. तो ये जो है, जो एक आदमी, आम आदमी है, वो दिन भर अपने काम में बिजी रहता है, उसके बस का तो है नहीं. तो इसका मतलब है कि सबसे अच्छा जो उपाय है कि आप किसी फंड मैनेजर, रिलायबल फंड मैनेजर के साथ आप अपना इन्वेस्ट कीजिए और फिल इट, शट इट, फॉरगेट वाला जैसा बात. तो इस पे आप क्या कहना चाहेंगे हिंदी में?
Okay, so I'll put it this way. I'll take a step back. हम जब बैंकिंग का बात करते हैं तो बैंकिंग में एक बहुत कॉमन टर्मिनोलॉजी हम सब लोग इन दिस रूम एवरीवन वुड नो, देयर इज अ टर्मिनोलॉजी कॉल्ड एसएलआर, स्टैट्यूटरी लिक्विडिटी रेशियो. इन पर्सनल फाइनेंस आल्सो आई थिंक देयर इज वन एसएलआर कॉन्सेप्ट knowingly or unknowingly in a saver's mind. That SLR stands for something else. That SLR is safety, liquidity and return, and possibly in that order, right? And you cannot deny the merit of that particular factor. You have to ensure that. My sense is that over a period of time, a very significant improvement that needs to come is थोड़ा एसेट एलोकेशन और थोड़ा एक्टिवली होने की जरूरत है, क्योंकि आप खाली सेफ्टी फैक्टर में डोमिनेटेड रहेंगे और पूरा के पूरा पैसा आपका बैंक का सेविंग्स डिपॉजिट में डालेंगे, बिकॉज दैट इज द मोस्ट सेफ एंड मोस्ट लिक्विड, देन यू विल नॉट गेट रिटर्न. सो समवेयर ओवर द लॉन्ग टर्म पीपल विल ट्राई टू स्ट्राइक दैट बैलेंस. Here, the role of the government is in terms of generating awareness so that people also know that safety factor किसमें कितना है, कहाँ आप कितना risk ले रहे हो. I think we are moving well in that particular direction. Over a period of time, I think people have started doing that allocation mental maths in the back of their mind that, okay, I need this much money at short notice, so I'll be keeping it here. Gradually, we have started talking a little more about insurance, still very less penetrated compared to the optimal level, but at least kuch to money ja raha hai udhar, and obviously the return factor is kind of pulling people towards more towards equity market and some of the more risky avenues where you can take the risk. I think iska saath financial entities ka, for example banks, for example a bank like mine where there is a lot of network in some of the even rural and relatively less penetrated areas, we are trying to have one particular approach which is also yielding fantastic result. We have realized that even at the bottom of the pyramid also there are pockets where there is very considerable level of saving potential, but that money is actually not coming in the mainstream. But for a bank, it's very costly if you actually try to ambush that particular market. You cannot do that. There comes the role, people talk about digital. I think there is a very significant role about data and analytics that we try to introduce in a very significant way where there is scale, where your efforts can be a lot more targeted, and actually you manage to educate people to go for this kind of financial savings products. So all these factors put together, I think, I go back to my previous comment that this is what gives me a lot of optimism about overall financial space and financial savings in general.
Right. तो रजनी और अतुल जी, दो बातें जो निकली हैं इनके कहने से ये है कि एक मैंने सुना पोर्टफोलियो एलोकेशन और दूसरा रिटर्न मैनेजमेंट. ये जो आम आदमी जब सुनता है वो तो हाथ खड़े कर देता है, वो तो बोला यार ये तो मुझे नहीं समझ आता ये क्या है. तो आप क्या कहेंगे, कैसे उनको क्या कहेंगे कि कैसे अपना पैसा मैनेज करना चाहिए, सबसे उचित उपाय क्या है?
मैं कहूँगी कि जैसा कि आपने कहा आम आदमी के लिए टाइम करना कि इक्विटी मार्केट कब टॉप में है या इंटरेस्ट रेट अब इससे बढ़ेगा घटेगा, ये बहुत मुश्किल है. सो आम आदमी को जो अपना एलोकेशन है वो अपने एज के हिसाब से करना चाहिए. जब वो यंगर हैं उन्हें थोड़ा रिस्क लेना चाहिए, उनको अपना ज़्यादा पोर्टफोलियो इक्विटी में रखना चाहिए और रिलेटिवली कम डेट में रखना चाहिए. और जैसे जैसे कि उनका एज बढ़ता है उनका डेट का प्रपोर्शन बढ़ा देना चाहिए. आई थिंक ये सिंपल कॉन्सेप्ट बेटर रहेगा. अगर उन्हें और कुछ नहीं समझ में आता है तो एटलीस्ट इतना वो करें. और अगर स्टॉक मार्केट में कर रहे हैं तो वो डायरेक्टली अगर वो नहीं समझ में आता है उन्हें किस स्टॉक में डालें क्या, तो वो म्यूचुअल फंड में SIP करें और वो SIP करके एक जो भी अमाउंट वो कर सकते हैं मंथली बेसिस में वो करके और वो भूल जाएं. क्योंकि अगर वो मार्केट का वो ऊपर चढ़ना गिरना वो देखेंगे और ट्रैक करेंगे तो वो घबरा जाएंगे, उनको लगेगा वो म्यूचुअल फंड से बाहर निकल जाएं. तो जैसा कि मेरे पैनलिस्ट ने पहले भी कहा कि इक्विटी मार्केट में आप डाल रहे हो तो 5 साल 10 साल के लिए आप पैसा डाल के भूल जाओ और SIP बेस्ट है उसमें, क्योंकि उसमें फिर आपको टाइम नहीं करना पड़ेगा.
अतुल जी, आपका सुझाव?
दो चीज़ें मैं कहूँगा. एक तो रजनी जी की बात बिल्कुल सही है कि उम्र के हिसाब से इन्वेस्ट करना चाहिए. दूसरा मैं कहूँगा कि हमारी संस्कृति को देख के इन्वेस्ट करना चाहिए. हम देखते हैं कि हमारी फैमिलीज़ में क्या होता है. हमारी फैमिलीज़ में ये होता है कि लड़का हो या लड़की हो, शादी में उसको सोना देना ही है. तो एक ये है कि अभी से ही उसका प्रोविज़न करते चले. लोग ये कहेंगे कि भैया ये बिल्कुल वेस्टफुल इन्वेस्टमेंट है, इससे कोई नौकरियां नहीं बनती. मैं कंप्लीटली डिसएग्री हूँ. एक बार किसी ज्वेलर की दुकान पे बैठिए और ये देखिए कि वो कितना एम्प्लॉयमेंट जनरेट करता है. वन ऑफ द बिगेस्ट एम्प्लॉयमेंट जनरेशन इज़ थ्रू गोल्ड एंड गोल्ड ज्वेलरी. तो मैं ये कहूँगा कि अगर आपके कुटुंब में शादी का जो चलता है वो व्यवहार चलता होगा तो धीरे धीरे 1 गिनी 2 गिनी 3 गिनी लेते रहिए. हम अगर हमारे पुरखों को देखें तो उनके पास ये ट्रेडिशन थी और आज भी कई सारी फैमिलीज इसको आगे बढ़ाती रही है. आज की तारीख में इसकी मैं एक ये दूंगा, साबिती ऐसे दूंगा कि गोल्ड लोन कंपनीज इतनी सक्सेसफुल क्यों हैं. गरीब के पास सोना था तो गोल्ड लोन कंपनीज में गोल्ड दे चुके, अगर नहीं होता तो क्या करते? तो ये बिल्कुल मेरे ख्याल से अनप्रोडक्टिव क्लास जिस तरह से बताया जाता है गोल्ड को, आई कंप्लीटली डिसएग्री। आपकी ट्रेडिशन के हिसाब से आप इन्वेस्टमेंट करना चालू करिए। दूसरा, आपका एजुकेशन। आज की तारीख में चाहे कितना भी आदमी गरीब हो, वो चाहेगा कि मेरा बच्चा पढ़े, तो आपको लॉन्ग टर्म इन्वेस्टमेंट चाहिए कि जब वो बच्चा ग्रेजुएट होगा तो उसको MBA में जाना है तो 5 लाख, 50 लाख, 60 लाख, कुछ भी एडमिशन फ़ी हो सकती है, तो उसको मद्देनज़र रख के अभी से कैसे सेविंग करें। तो यह है कि एक तो आप रिस्क लीजिए, इक्विटी में देखिए, लेकिन ये भी होता है कि आपको इक्विटी में अगर इन्वेस्ट करना है तो आपको चौकन्ना रहना पड़ता है। ये भी हकीकत है कि अगर जिस वक्त आपको डिसइन्वेस्ट करना हो तभी कोई ग्लोबल इवेंट हो गया तो आपकी प्राइस 30, 40, 50% वैसे ही निकल जाती है। तो ऐसा नहीं है कि आपने इक्विटी में इन्वेस्ट किया तो आपको प्रॉफिट होना ही होना है, या आपने इन्वेस्टमेंट SIP में किया या म्यूचुअल फंड में किया तो आपको प्रॉफिट होना ही होना है। इक्विटी मीन्स रिस्क। चौकन्ना रहिए, 24/7 वो एबिलिटी है तो आप बिल्कुल इन्वेस्ट करिए, खूब पैसा बनेगा। 1 लाख से आप 50 लाख आराम से बना सकते हैं, चौकन्ना रहिए। या फिर आप जाइए लॉन्ग टर्म इन्वेस्टमेंट्स। लॉन्ग टर्म इन्वेस्टमेंट्स में आपको मैं कहूँगा सबसे सेफ तो GSEC है ही है, गवर्नमेंट ऑफ इंडिया सिक्योरिटीज़ है, और आज की तारीख में आप 5,000 रुपये से लेके 5 करोड़ रुपया एज एन इंडिविजुअल आप सेव कर सकते हैं, तो वो भी एक ऑप्शन आपके पास है। लॉन्ग टर्म बॉन्ड्स होते हैं, जैसे कि SBI के बॉन्ड्स है, 81 बॉन्ड्स है, आपको आज 8.25, 8.5, 8.9% मिल रहा है। तो आप अगर देखेंगे तो काफ़ी सारे इन्वेस्टमेंट एवेन्यूज़ तो है, लेकिन हमारी जो ज़रूरियात है उसके हिसाब से भी हमको इन्वेस्टमेंट करना चाहिए, उम्र का तकाजा लेते हुए, लेकिन साथ ही साथ हमारी जो फैमिली ट्रेडिशंस है और हमको जो लगता है कि कहाँ कहाँ पर हमको कब कब तकलीफ आएगी, उसके लिए प्रोविजन करके अगर इन्वेस्टमेंट करते चलेंगे तो बोरोइंग का समय नहीं आएगा।
So now we down to the last 3 minutes of this panel. One thing which I want to wrap up this panel on is the fact that a lot of people, the average Indian has an expectation from the government that the government will do something to incentivize me to save. But like Kennedy very famously said, don't ask what the government can do for you, what you can do for the government. Here we are asking people only to do it for themselves. Like how can you become financially more secure? So that's the question they have to ask themselves. Saugata, let me start with you and we'll try to wrap this up in 3 minutes with all 4 of you. Are we now in an era where the investor should expect that the SOPs and incentives that were given before to encourage, say, savings and other investments, although in this budget also we had the Mahila, Samman saving scheme which was launched. Is that like gone now? Are we in a different era now as investors?
So to a certain extent that's over and done, because एक तो है जो ELSS investments थे, उतना पैसा उतना successful नहीं हुआ है। बाकी इंटरेस्ट रेट्स, महिला सम्मान, सुकन्या समृद्धि, हाँ ये सब के लिए स्पेसिफिक स्कीम्स के लिए टारगेटिंग स्पेसिफिक ग्रुप्स, हाँ उनके लिए वो टारगेट करके उनको हायर इंटरेस्ट रेट्स दे रहे हैं गवर्नमेंट। थर्ड है EPF, PF मैंने जो हमारे जो प्रोविडेंट फंड और स्मॉल सेविंग्स के इंस्ट्रूमेंट्स हैं वहाँ पे हाई रेट्स बढ़ा के रखे हैं, वहाँ पे वो खींचने की कोशिश कर रहे हैं। बट वही चीज़ है, बार बार वही कह रहा हूँ यहाँ पे कि रादर देन दी स्पेसिफिक इंसेंटिव्स को इसको ट्वीक करे उसको ट्वीक करे, वो नहीं, एक कंसिस्टेंट प्रोग्राम रखे कि अगले 7 साल में 10 साल में 6.5% हमारा ग्रोथ होगा। लास्ट टाइम रिमेंबर ये 2003 से लेके 2008 तक के बिफोर द ग्लोबल फाइनेंशियल क्राइसिस स्पॉइल्ड दैट पार्टी, हाँ वो दैट वाज द गोल्डन ईयर्स ऑफ ग्रोथ एंड द गोल्डन ईयर्स ऑफ सेविंग्स। वो मैंने गवर्नमेंट का ये सब छोटे मोटे ट्वीक करके थोड़ा बहुत तो जाएगा ये पैसा, मैंने 10,000 करोड़ आएगा, लेकिन पूरे स्कीम में जहाँ पे 40 लाख 50 लाख करोड़ की बात कर रहे हैं हम लोग, क्या फर्क पड़ता है यहाँ पे, वो सब नहीं। तो एक गवर्नमेंट को करना है, ग्रोथ पे नजर रखे, बिल्कुल फोकस वहाँ पे रखे।
सिद्धार्थ,
आई थिंक लॉन्ग टर्म में 2-3 चीजें इंपॉर्टेंट है इसमें। वन फैक्टर इज कंसिस्टेंट पॉलिसी, so you cannot go one step forward, one step backward. I think that's very important. In that context, given that we are moving towards a slightly more cleaner regime, is not a bad thing to have. And people, I mean, the target group of savers, they are also maturing over time. So it's not a bad thing. So consistency is possibly the key. ensuring safety of the various instruments or making people aware of the various risks that they are taking is possibly the other most important thing. And there, it's not only the responsibility of the regulator and policymakers. I think every stakeholder associated with the financial ecosystem, regulators, policymakers, banks, NBFCs, media, analysts, everyone would have to play a role apart from that. I think these two are the long-term key to me.
Great. Rajani?
So I'll simply put it that research shows that not just in India but globally also, tax incentives do not necessarily lead to increased saving, household savings. So I think, like what my other panelists have been saying, the government focus should be on growth. High per capita income will ensure higher savings. So that's what the focus should be on. In fact, removing with the new tax regime, with all these tax incentives going, in fact, there'll be flexibility to the households to invest in whichever they find apt, whichever asset.
Atul?
मेरे हिसाब से फाइनेंशियल लिटरेसी सबसे ज़्यादा इम्पॉर्टेंट है। आज की तारीख में गांव-गांव में लोगों को पता है कि पीएम आवास योजना है, लेकिन किसी को भी पता नहीं कि आरबीआई की सिक्योरिटी 5,000 रुपये में मैं खरीद सकता हूँ। तो फाइनेंशियल लिटरेसी गवर्नमेंट को उसमें इन्वेस्ट ही नहीं करना है। तो आई थिंक फाइनेंशियल लिटरेसी गवर्नमेंट को खुद को इन्वेस्ट करना चाहिए। और टैक्स ऑप्स का मेरे हिसाब से तो कोई इतना इम्पैक्ट नहीं पड़ेगा, लेकिन इंडिविजुअल्स के लिए अगर हमको डिस्पोजेबल इनकम बढ़ानी है तो मेरे ख्याल से इंटरेस्ट रेट रिस्क जो आज की तारीख में इंडिविजुअल्स के पास है उसको थोड़ा हटा के इंस्टीट्यूशंस के पास लेके जाना चाहिए।
Right. I'll want to end this panel with one bonus question to Atul because he's the financial advisor to a lot of people. Atul, one of the very interesting points made by one of the previous speakers, and that was an advice to the common investor, is that don't focus on just returns, focus on your goals. आपने बेटी की शादी करानी है, बच्चे को बाहर पढ़ाना है, गाड़ी लेना है, बड़ा घर लेना है, जो भी है, आप उस पे फोकस कीजिए, आप रिटर्न्स पे मत फोकस, because that is tangible and returns can keep varying. So, what is your take on that?
नहीं, बिल्कुल। देखिए, मैं एक ऐसे सबब से आता हूँ, मैं विले पार्ला में रहता हूँ। वहाँ पे आप देखिए कि बच्चा पैदा होते ही बाप घर खरीद लेता है। देखिए, सीधी सादी बात है, बच्चा पैदा हुआ कि घर खरीद लो, ये एंशिएंट विजडम है उनकी। तो क्या होगा कि बच्चे का जो हाउसिंग रिलेटेड इन्फ्लेशन है ऑलरेडी टेकन केयर ऑफ। पैसा है तो बात अलग है, लेकिन आई एम सेइंग कि ये एक सोच है, उस सोच को आप पकड़ के रखिए कि आपको आपके बच्चों को सिक्योर करना है, ना कि उसको बोरोवर बनाना है। उसने क्रेडिट कार्ड लिया, उसने पर्सनल लोन लिया, उसको कार चाहिए, उसने कार के लिए लोन ली, घर चाहिए, घर के लिए लोन ली, क्यों लेनी है? आप प्लानिंग वैसे करिए कि जो आपके गोल्स है उसके हिसाब से आप अभी से प्लानिंग करिए। जितना रिटर्न्स इग्नोर नहीं कर सकते हैं, एजुकेट करिए, फाइनेंशियल लिटरेसी से रिटर्न्स मैनेज करिए, रिस्क मैनेज करिए, कैपिटल लॉस को मिनिमाइज करिए।
Excellent. I think we got some really great points from each of the panelists today. If most of the ARM investors maybe took away just 50% of what they said, I think they'll all be very rich as India grows. So let me thank all my panelists, and I request the audience to give them a huge round of applause.
Thank you so much, Sridhar, for this इंटरेस्टिंग टॉक। बॉलीवुड भी था, पैसा भी था, निवेश भी था, बच्चे और गाड़ी भी थे, तो बहुत अच्छी लगी ये सारी बातें। इकोनॉमिस्ट के मुंह से हम आज जब सुन रहे थे तो हमें समझ में आ रहा था कि निवेशक जो गलतियां कर रहा है उसको समझने को, अगर उसे समझ में नहीं आ रहा है तो इस पैनल को जो श्रीधरन के साथ आज हमारे स्टीम पैनलिस्ट थे, क्या ये सुनना चाहिए, जो मनी 9 बार बार आपको यही कह रहा है। थैंक यू श्रीधरन, थैंक यू सो मच गेस्ट, बट आई वुड जस्ट वांट ऑल ऑफ यू टू वेट हियर बिकॉज आई वांट टू इनवाइट नाउ Kalpak Kekre, channel head, TV9 Gujarati. Please, sir, please come on the stage and honor our experts today.
Can we have the mementos, please?
A big round of applause for a very interesting conversation.
Kalpak ji, please, mementos देकर सम्मान कीजिए हमारे गेस्ट का। तालियां रुकनी नहीं चाहिए, एक बार जोरदार तालियां फिर से। देखिए आज हमको बहुत सारी काम की बातें पता चली, इतना तो हम कर ही सकते हैं अपने गेस्ट के लिए कि तालियों से उनका आभार जरूर जताएं।
मुझे लग रहा है तालियों का जोश कम हो रहा है।
कोई बात नहीं, इसके बाद टी ब्रेक लेते हैं।
हाँ, चाय के
थोड़ा
जोश
चाय
की जरूरत है।
जोश भी आएगा और आगे और भी बहुत सारी काम की बातें होंगी।
थैंक यू सो मच सर, थैंक यू सो मच। और एक शानदार पिक्चर भी हो जाए इस शानदार पैनल के साथ, तो प्लीज मुस्कुराइए आप सभी। एक बहुत शानदार सी पिक्चर हम ले रहे हैं आज के इस कॉन्क्लेव को यादगार बनाने के लिए। आप सभी का धन्यवाद। मैं आपको बताना चाहूंगी कि Money9 और TV9 के अलग अलग प्लेटफॉर्म में, यूट्यूब चैनल्स पर, फेसबुक पर हम लाइव हैं। हमारे लाइव ऑडियंस भी जुड़े हुए हैं, इस बातचीत को सुन रहे हैं। थैंक यू ऑल कि आप लोग सब जुड़े हुए हैं। एक शिकायत बार बार आ रही है गौरव कि हम इंग्लिश में ज्यादा बात कर रहे हैं क्या गौरव आज?
नहीं बिल्कुल नहीं, ये बातें जितनी हो उतना अच्छा है, क्योंकि फाइनेंशियल फ्रीडम इसी से आएगी, फाइनेंशियल इंक्लूजन और फाइनेंशियल विजडम इसी से आएगा।
बिल्कुल, और बहुत ही इंटरेस्टिंग सेशन हम अभी और लेकर आने वाले हैं अगले हाफ में। एक छोटा सा ब्रेक लेते हैं क्योंकि तालियों की आवाज थोड़ी सी धीमी हो रही है, थोड़े से जोश की जरूरत है यहाँ पर।
तो आप चाय पीते हैं और चाय के बाद चर्चा करेंगे,
लेकिन 4 बजे बहुत ही खास मेहमान का सेशन है।